Okay, next up is Aethermarked, a dark fantasy GameLit Isekai, written by Damian Hansen and Nolan Locke. It is 557 pages, $4.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. Full disclosure, I've received an advance copy for review. I purchased a copy when it became available. Here's the author's description. Friendless. Grief, broken by grief, tired of the real world, Jin-ee represents the perfect candidate for the new on-site 24/7 fully immersive gaming sensation, Aethermarked. Of course, becoming Phallania Trevellian is more than she ever dreamed and more than she bargained for. From the moment she submerges into a vat of conductive nanogel and chooses her first spell, she's captivated at the reality and wonder of the wide, magical world around her. A new life so different that she's had in the real world. That is, until the game refuses to let her out. Jin-ee has no choice to become her character and trusts the people behind the game are honestly trying to free her rather than use her as a televised marketing sensation to drive us sales. Things take a turn down a dark path when Phallania faces down eldritch horrors and battles fiends for her very survival. It is only then that she realized that what she thought was a game may be more than she bargained for. And there's a warning here. It says, things get dark at times. There might be some content you find traumatic. This lit RPG Isekai contains scenes of torture and minor fade to black sexual content. So there we go. I didn't end up liking this story. I kind of wanted to. There are different elements that I thought were nicely done. But overall, I found it to be a frustrating reading experience, mostly because of issues of the story that made it feel less cohesive. And there are just some really super annoying things that happened to the story. I was like, no, this doesn't work. First of all, let me talk about the things I enjoyed. The story does a good job of fleshing out the backstory of the MMO character. Again, not the main character, Jin-ee, but the character she becomes. In that it does like some after character creation, it does some fleshing out like memories. Like it shows the main character as her game character as a little girl playing a chess-like board game with their dad, and I thought that was probably one of the best scenes in the entire story, mostly because it did something that was really well. It did world building. It fleshed out the main character and her relationship with her father, and at the same time, it kind of gave you a hint at the game mechanics of the story through the game itself. Like the little girl and her father are playing this board game, and there are 4 different factions that are supposed to represent the factions in their world. And the dad is like playing the game, playing different sections, and they're at the same time describing their interaction. They're giving information to the reader about, oh, these are the character classes, these are their powers, this is how they use them on a regular basis. These are their interfaction, issues and how they come about. And it's just like a really nicely well done summarized section that I thought was like really on point tonight. And if that's what that story had been, if the story there's a story had been that main character exploring those factions, exploring that world building, going throughout the world, seeing that scene, I think I would have liked it. I would have enjoyed that story there. That's not what this is, though. Like the novel description talks about the main character being trapped in an MMO and things like, oh, is the game company using her for publicity purposes? Are they really trying to get her out? And to be honest, that stuff does exist. It is in the first 20-25% of the story, and it kind of peters in a little bit. But for the most part, none of that matters. It really doesn't. Like the setup in the beginning of the story has no bearing on the rest of it. And I'm like, and that was an issue for you. Like the things that are set up in the beginning of the story leave some huge gaping plot holes as the story progresses. Like there are things that happen that I'm like, this is set up as an MMO game, and there's issues with the game mechanics, but at the same time, it is basically a fantasy time travel story. And I'll get into all that later, but it's like there's this huge conflict between those two kind of themes in the story, the game stuff as an MMO and the fantasy time travel stuff. And those things conflict so hard that it ended up making me just not like the story, unfortunately. But again, good things first. Sorry, good things first. We're talking about good things first. The game system in the story is actually really well fleshed out. I think you can tell that the authors put a lot of time and effort into thinking of this balanced system. Class powers for each particular faction has their own unique character classes, their own unique powers and abilities, and they seem to balance each other out in the beginning of the story. And again, I like that design aspect. And again, unfortunately, it doesn't matter to the story. Like those abilities, those separate classes and powers don't matter, because they eventually in the story, things happen that show them to not be such a rigid game structure. I'll leave it at that, I guess. But there's just things that happen with the main characters, like, oh, all that early stuff, nope, doesn't matter. Not to say that the game powers don't continue to show through the story, and that this isn't an RPG. It is. There are regular notifications. The main character levels up, even though she probably shouldn't as much. But it really felt like, as the story progressed in the novel, that it was more and more of just like a fantasy story with time travel, and that the game mechanics existed as a way to describe the powers and not as an interesting aspect and a fully fleshed out part of this world in the first place. It felt like they were just reflective of power game, and that the story could have existed without them, to a degree. Not the trapped in the game part stuff and that element to that is fully part of the story, but like the actual description of the powers themselves, the actual mechanics of the thing, that would have just wasn't as important to the story, unfortunately. The very beginning of the story. So on to some of the things I didn't like. I mentioned a couple of them. There's some things that I just found annoying. Other things that I found like, story breaking for me, at least. The very beginning of the story, the setup about full immersion, the main character going to a full immersion game and winning this contest, super annoying to me. And that's mostly because from the writing, I could tell that it wasn't going to matter in the story. Like, it was that the writing itself felt very perfunctory, felt very like, there's a lot of grandiose writing, and it's set up like this Charlie in the Charlotte Factory kind of opening, where the main character applies for her spot in this new game that nobody's ever played before. It's supposed to be amazing, but you probably should have questioned why the fact they asked if she had any living relatives or people who were going to miss her. She disappeared. And yet she wins, and she's super happy, and there's this big fanfare in the beginning of the story, and I'm like, as I'm reading it just kind of fell flat. I'm like, man, this lady's going to get trapped in this game, and none of this is going to matter, is it? And totally right. I mean, it's in the novel description. It's not spoilery whatsoever. But at the same time, all that early setup stuff, almost none of it comes back. Like, the main character, without getting spoilery, none of that matters to the story whatsoever. The entire thing is gets her in the game, and it just didn't matter to the story. And that kind of frustrating, because you spend time, you have an expectation that even with the Trapped in the Game story, you have expectation that this is supposed to be an MMO world, and so along with that, you have, as a gamer, expectations of what this is going to be like, and none of that really applies to the story, unfortunately. Thankfully, though, that opening doesn't last too long. About the 4% mark, main hero character, so that's perfectly fine. The early part of the story, on the whole, wasn't half bad. I didn't care for the forced romance, where the main character asked the game to copy a memory of her bad ex-boyfriend, and then asked the game to block her memory of it so she thinks it's a natural romance. I thought that was definitely odd and weird. I mean, I know the author's kind of inserted to show that the game could change her memories, but it's just kind of a weird thing to insert as a romance section. I'm like, okay. But it wasn't like terrible enough to like made me start reading. Just, okay, that kind of showed you the level of like, what to expect for the romance options in this novel. And that definitely panned out like I thought it would. Things that made the story more, how to say, unbearable, but just not likable for me. The Trapped in the Game plotline. It shows up by the 14% mark, and I'll be honest, the story was doing fine without it. Like, up until that point, it was very slice of life. The main character had gone through the memory cutscenes that fleshed out her backstory for her game character, and she was just going along the world, exploring things, making friends, going on adventures, fighting monsters. I'm like, this is kind of nice. It gradually showed what her class options were, what she could do with them, and exploring those powers. And it felt very familiar and nice and slice of life. And I really liked. I was okay with that. I was having a good time. And then 40% arc, Trapped in the Game. I was like, okay, I was right. And to be honest, the trapped in the game stuff really interrupts what could have been an interesting storyline about intrigue and guile-based abilities and factions vying for control and power within country. Like there's a lot of like really cool story options and paths that it could have taken from like that early section of the story. But none of that is really none of that is really fleshed out to a great degree. It then becomes about the main character being trapped in the game and essentially being forced down story paths because of it. And that's what all the trapped in the games thing really does here. It really just forces her to do certain things because the game administrators or the person who's communicating, they're saying, oh no, we have no idea what's happening here. Maybe you should finish this really difficult and life-threatening quest line to try to reset the game. And it really felt super forced, and that the story was meant to go down this path so that the main character get these different powers, interact with these different characters, and it being, heroes or villains or whatever the case is in the story. But it felt super forced, and it felt really unnatural because if you're trapped in the game, and if you die in the game, you die in real life, you're not going to do dangerous things. I mean, that's pretty much the option. I mean, really, if you look at other stories and that's fleshed out and that feels very real, and that you look at Sword Art Online or the story had the same premise, most people just did not want to threaten their lives, and that's a very natural feeling. So to force the main character down this path where she's in super danger and things do not go well, like the story warning says, things get dark, and they certainly do, and that includes her being tortured and mentally tortured and physically tortured through like magical powers, and it's described. There's no way that a real person would ever choose to do that stuff, especially considering that she's feeling full amounts of pain. And it's just one of those things that wasn't done well with the trapped in the game system. And that's really hard to get right, which is one of the reasons I don't really like when I see trapped in the game, because a lot of people just can't get it right. Like Sword Art Online is the thing they look at as the model for it, but in that story, there's a huge variety of people in this situation, and they show the tension, they show the threat to your life by killing people in the game who are trapped there, and giving them permanent deaths and making them feel important to you and then murder them off. And so when the main character risks his life to try to free everyone, it matters. It's a real risk that he's taking. You feel that threat because there's a real possibility they can die. But in a lot of games who do trapped in the game and die in the game down their life, that doesn't exist. Instead, it becomes a thing where the main character is never going to die no matter what they do, whatever risks they take, whatever things they go through. And it ruins attention because in real life, in real gaming terms, characters die. They die. You reset. You respawn. That's the whole point of it, to learn from your failures and your experiences. And so when that doesn't exist in a game that's supposed to be an MMO, even though apparently there are no other players in this MMO, that kind of clashes with the expectations of what an MMO is supposed to be. One of those things that is hard to get right. Additionally, the story halfway through kind of seems to abandon the game stuff, or that at least how important it is to a large degree, as it introduces time travel, which is not. It's kind of hinted in the game mechanics that exists, but the way it's used and the way the powers are given to the main character completely ignores any of the actual MMO game stuff that happens. And there's some contrived story reason why this exists, but it really just feels like, the authors wanted to play with these other powers. And the way the main character gains his power and other powers and does that is because she needs them when she needs them. And so she magically gains them anytime she has a need for them. She literally is grabbing powers from all the other classes, all the other things, without meeting any prereqs or earning any effort, to be honest. And that felt really cheap for me in terms of like game progression. Like all the power she got, she never earned. So that's always a big deal for me. But the time travel especially is hard to get right in the story. And this one doesn't, unfortunately. It's used as this kind of escape button, where the main character gets into trouble, uses time power, and it doesn't just send her one direction, they go backwards and forwards, and it also changes her location. And so the authors kind of use this as a way to get her out of her predicaments, but also put her in different situations where she can see other threats, other influences, kind of do a little bit of world exploring or world building. And that it's kind of used in that respect as a kind of catch-all get her in and out of trouble that's caused by this same power. And I was like, that to me is, it's really just kind of ruined the story to a degree, because again, the main character is not earning her power. She's not earning this information. She's just really doing plopped in situations, and she stumbles her way through without any real effort to resolve them on her. Other people tend to come in and out of life and help her with the situation. And unfortunately, like in a lot of game mechanics, their importance rather to the story kind of get twisted. Some information established at the beginning of the story, as far as game mechanics go, no longer apply to the main character as the story goes. And again, there is a story revelation that tries to explain this away, but it was kind of predictable. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. So there it is. It is what it is. Other story twists, again, I'm not trying not to spoil much of them, but it always seemed that the story was struggling with itself to kind of maintain this balance between the game elements and what's supposed to be an MMO and this kind of fantasy time travel story. And for me, it created a lot of plot holes where I was like, oh, that stuff at the beginning doesn't apply here, or this is a lie here, or there's a big plot hole, or this shouldn't happen according to what we've already been told. And it kind of ruined, because a lot of the things I like about a Little Bitty Story is that the game mechanics matter. They are as hard coded into the system as physics are. And so if you learn the game rules, if you learn how the system works, that's how you gain control. That's how you gain power. That's how you gain the ability to improve your life and your situation, because you understand the rules, and the rules matter. And the class system matters. And unfortunately for the story, to a degree, that just kind of disappears as story goes. Not to say that the mechanics themselves disappear. The main character still levels. She still applies some stat points here and there and some other skill abilities. But fundamentally, no, doesn't matter. Not as far as they go. Again, the one new power she gets is that she gets any power she needs in the situation as it dictates, and it just magically appears, in addition to the ability to travel through time and space, apparently. And so those things tend to matter more to the plot line, unfortunately. Also, small technical pet peeve about this story. It has pages and pages and pages of stat sheets. There's really no need to show like the full character sheet with like all those details every single time the main character leveled. After like the first couple times, it felt like a lot of filler. I would have been perfectly okay to just like see the changes, the things that she actually changed if she leveled, or distributed stat points or class skills or whatever the case was going to be, or just reminders, like, oh, this is a thing she has, this is a particular stat, because it really ended up being like page after page after page after page of stuff that didn't matter to this particular situation. It was just kind of there because it was there, and it ended up feeling a little like filler, unfortunately. Small thing, didn't really affect the score either way. It's just, that probably could have been a little better. Overall, again, I liked some elements, especially that first game chess playing scene. I thought that was really nicely done, but the story didn't work for me. Worse, as it progressed, I really ended up not liking, especially the way the story resolves the antagonist issue. I thought that was terrible. Not on a technical writing level, but I was like, it doesn't make logical sense that the person, and again, this isn't spoilery, it's in the description that the main character is tortured, but the person who tortures her, she essentially just like, and this is a little bit spoilery, so clear out, stop the video if you don't want to hear it, but it bugged me so much, it kind of one of the things that ruined it for me. She doesn't kill him when she has a chance. And I'm like, this is after she's been physically and mentally tortured. She gets a chance, and there's some story game elements that are just super forced to prevent her to a degree. But time and again, multiple times in the story, she just is like, no, we can't kill him. He's going to be super important in helping us to deal with this other threat. I mean, this is literally the person that tortured her for days and weeks or whatever on end, mentally, physically. And I'm like, okay, no reasonable person is not going to take some revenge on this character, even with the restrictions that are placed on her by the forced magical powers. So one of those things. So there you go. And a bigger issue for me again is that the story was always kind of in conflict with itself thematically between the game elements, the MMO stuff, that's really talked about at the beginning of the story as being a major thing, and the eventual fantasy time travel thing that goes on in the story. And so for me, that disjointedness kind of just pushed it past. This doesn't work for me. To I don't like this story to a big degree, unfortunately. And I've liked the author's other works. They have other things that they've done that are more humorous, and plenty of fans are liked it. It's just that this one it had so many things that I didn't enjoy, and I'm going to score 4 out of 10. So that's Aethermarked, a dark fantasy GameLit Isekai story with a score of 4 out of 10.